A new report by Yahoo News has come out with some serious claims. It goes into details about the CIA's war on WikiLeaks and its founder, even stating that the U.S. had plans to abduct or even assassinate Julian Assange. Yahoo News spoke with 30 former U.S. intelligence and national security officials for this story, and the former Secretary of State and former CIA Director Mike Pompeo is calling for all of those sources to face criminal charges. I want to bring in Michael Isikoff. He's the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News, and he co-wrote this report. Michael, this is an astounding report, and you've reported that the government started to turn up the heat on Julian Assange after the leak of information known as Vault 7. For people who may not know or may not remember, explain what this leak contained and why it was so sensitive.
Right. This leak, which actually WikiLeaks began publishing in early months of 2017, exposed the CIA's most sensitive hacking tools that it used to launch offensive cyber activities around the world, penetrating computer networks, penetrating phones, intercepting communications of perceived American adversaries. And it was considered at the time the largest data loss in CIA history. And Mike Pompeo, who had just come in as the new CIA director, was enraged by this. This had happened. This was now his agency. It's on his turf. And he wanted revenge against WikiLeaks. He wanted to crack down and cripple the organization. And as we report, he ordered up all sorts of aggressive plans. This began with his public description of WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence service. And that opened the door for the CIA to plan all sorts of operations, including the abduction of Julian Assange, and there was talk even of a possible assassination. And as we report, these plans, these proposals, ideas that the CIA was cooking up provoked intense debate within the Trump White House, really one of the most contentious intelligence debates of the Trump era.
So let's talk a little bit about some of these ideas that the CIA was cooking up. What lengths was the organization willing to go through to get their hands on Julian Assange and shut down WikiLeaks?
Well, pretty far. As I mentioned, the kidnapping, abduction plans were taken pretty seriously and pushed by Pompeo. It was part of a sort of multi-pronged attack that the CIA director and top officials wanted to launch on WikiLeaks that would include monitoring and tracking the communications and travels of WikiLeaks associates, in sowing discord among the ranks of WikiLeaks, stealing computers, all sorts of really aggressive actions, the kind of thing that the CIA might take against other hostile government intelligence services, such as the Iranians or the North Koreans. But as I mentioned, there was a lot of concern that the CIA was getting ahead of its skis on this one. And one of the responses was for the Trump White House to spur the Justice Department to accelerate its plans to indict Julian Assange. One of the issues with an abduction, which is what Pompeo was talking about at one point, was there was no indictment of Assange at that point. This is in 2017. So where would you take him on? What authority could you hold somebody in custody if there are no criminal charges against that person? And that's one of the spurs that got the Justice Department in late 2017 to indict Julian Assange.
So, Michael, on Megyn Kelly's podcast yesterday, Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State, former CIA director, responded to your piece saying that the sources you and your colleagues spoke to should face criminal charges. This is something that we've seen increasingly from politicians, and not just Republican ones. President Obama was known, was probably the president that had tried to use the Espionage Act against journalists more than any other president before. But
not probably, he did.
Yeah, not probably, exactly.
Eric Holder, the Attorney General during President Obama. Yeah, but those were pretty remarkable comments. by Mike Pompeo yesterday on the Megyn Kelly podcast. We spoke to me and my two colleagues, Zach Dorfman and Sean Naylor. We all contributed to the piece. Spoke to as many as 30 former intelligence and U.S. government officials about this. Pompeo said they should all be prosecuted, criminally prosecuted for speaking to Yahoo News about this. As ACLU lawyer Ben Wisner commented for our piece about this, Pompeo essentially just confirmed the story, because you can only be prosecuted for disclosing real and legitimate classified information. So if Pompeo wants them prosecuted, it means he's just implicitly saying, yeah, this exposed CIA secrets.
So, you mentioned that federal grand juries have indicted Julian Assange on charges that he illegally obtained and published classified information. But what is the situation now with him in terms of those cases? He was arrested at the Ecuadorian embassy, where he'd been living for years and years and years. But he's still sort of languishing in a UK jail. Is he going to be extradited? Where do things stand?
Well, a very good question, because the U.S. Justice Department, under Merrick Garland, President Biden's Attorney General, is pursuing the extradition case. A British judge earlier this year denied the U.S. request to extradite Assange to face criminal charges in the United States on the grounds that he would face a high risk of suicide in a U.S. prison. Now, the Garland Justice Department is appealing that, and it's before a British appellate court now, while Assange remains in prison. But one point, that I think a number of people have made is that Assange's legal team are looking for ways to cite our story and bring it to the attention of the British courts as grounds to deny the U.S. Justice Department request, saying, how can you send this guy back to a country some of whose top officials wanted to kidnap or even assassinate him?
So, Michael, Daniel Ellsberg, who you know and students of history and journalism history know, leaked the Pentagon Papers, is calling for President Biden to drop his appeal to extradite Assange to the U.S. to face charges. The charges against Ellsberg were eventually dropped in 1973 because of how the government investigated Ellsberg. How are the cases similar, and is there legal precedent for dropping the charges against Assange, given what you've discovered?
Yeah, actually, interesting that you should mention that, because when we did the story, the very first point, or one of the first points that Assange's U.S. lawyer raised is the parallels to Daniel Ellsberg's case. Daniel Ellsberg was indicted by the Nixon administration for leaking the Pentagon Papers, but it then later turned out that the Nixon White House had planned all sorts of really extreme operations against Ellsberg, including breaking into his psychiatrist's office to try to get files that could be used against him. And this ultimately led to the dismissal of the case on the grounds of government misconduct. Now, we know in Ellsberg's case that the government really did break into his psychiatrist's office. In our story about WikiLeaks and Assange, we report that while the kidnapping and some of the most extreme measures that Pompeo was pushing were never green-lighted, there were a lot of pretty aggressive measures taken, including the CIA was getting audio and video feeds from inside the Ecuadorian embassy of Assange, essentially spying on him, while, as his lawyers assert, he was talking to them, his lawyers, and doctors, having all sorts of communications that would be considered privileged. So that could well be grounds for at least an argument that there was similar kinds of government misconduct here that should lead to at least either the British courts rejecting the extradition request, or if Assange is returned to face a trial in the United States, motions for government misconduct by the United States.
Michael Isikoff, really fascinating reporting. Thanks so much for joining us.
Sure enough, thank you.